At 5 o'clock on the morning of December 31st, 1994, the citizens of Grozny woke to thunder. Russian bombs struck oil storage tanks on the city's western perimeter, igniting columns of black smoke that climbed into the winter sky like the fingers of a closing fist. The Oil Institute in the center blazed next, adding its own petroleum darkness to the air. By the time the 131st MyCop Motor Rifle Brigade's armored column began its advance toward the central railway station, visibility had collapsed into a labyrinth of smoke, shadow, and spreading fire. The young conscripts of the MyCop Brigade had received no reconnaissance, no maps of the streets they were entering, no warning of what waited in the 5-story buildings pressing close on either side. Their T-72 and T-80 tanks, designed for the open plains of a European war that never came, could elevate their main guns only 14 to 15 degrees above horizontal. In these narrow avenues, with Chechen fighters positioned in upper windows barely 30 meters away, that limitation became a death sentence. The tanks could not raise their barrels high enough to return fire. They rolled forward blind. Near the station, a Russian communications officer heard a voice crackle through his headset. The words were Chechen, transmitted deliberately for the Russians to hear. "Welcome to hell." Then the ambush erupted from every direction at once. RPG teams firing from depot buildings, from the post office, from darkened apartment windows on the 4th and 5th floors. Volleys of rocket-propelled grenades arced downward onto the thin-top armor of the tanks. One after another, the vehicles exploded or lurched to a halt. Tracks severed, turrets jammed at useless angles. Colonel Ivan Savin radioed desperately for artillery support. His calls went unanswered. Jamming choked the nets. Outside, the ammunition inside struck vehicles began to cook off, sending turrets spinning skyward on pillars of flame. By the time the smoke cleared, 20 of 26 tanks lay destroyed. 102 of 120 armored vehicles sat wrecked in the streets. Nearly 800 men were dead, wounded, or missing in a single night. The New Year's massacre had rewritten Russian military doctrine in blood. The technical specifications told the story before the battle even began. Russian T-72 tanks could elevate their main guns only 14 degrees above horizontal. In the vertical geometry of Grozny's apartment blocks, where Chechen fighters positioned themselves on 4th and 5th floors, this meant the killing zone began at roughly 30 meters from any building. The tanks became blind, their turrets locked in a horizontal plane, while the enemy controlled the dimension above. Inside the steel coffins, conscript crews understood the mathematics of their deaths. When a column committed to a street flanked by 5-story buildings, the tankers knew they were entering a tube with no exit. The Chechens had perfected the geometry of the ambush, let the lead vehicles pass, destroy the rear elements to seal the trap, then work systematically from above. An RPG warhead could penetrate 300 millimeters of armor. A T-72's turret roof was 40 millimeters thick. The crews had no infantry screen to clear the buildings ahead. The gun could not elevate. Reversing meant colliding with the vehicle behind, already burning. Dismounting meant stepping into the street, where automatic weapons fire swept the pavement in overlapping arcs. The burning continued for weeks. Russian forces ground forward through Grozny's districts in brutal attrition. Artillery pounded buildings into rubble. Infantry cleared what remained, room by room, floor by floor. The presidential palace absorbed hundreds of direct hits through January. On the 17th, two 9-ton bunker buster bombs struck the building. One penetrated to the basement, killing between 50 and 60 wounded fighters. The other landed 20 meters from Aslan Maskhadov's headquarters without detonating. Maskhadov escaped. The battle dragged on through March 6, 1995. Russian forces captured ruins, not territory. The Chechen fighters melted away, regrouped, struck again from positions cleared days before. The city became a landscape of shattered masonry and scattered ordnance, disease haunting the broken streets where corpses decomposed in the winter cold. By 1996, Russia withdrew. The institutional lesson crystallized within the Russian military command. Urban combat was unacceptable. The cost in lives, the spectacle of burning columns broadcast on television, all of it created a doctrinal determination that would reshape everything when they returned. They would return, but next time, they would not send their soldiers into the streets. Between 1996 and 1999, Chechnya's independence dissolved into warlord chaos. More than 1,000 victims disappeared into the kidnapping economy. Several were beheaded when ransoms failed. Then Shamil Basayev crossed the border. On August 7, 1999, more than 1,000 fighters invaded Dagestan. On August 10th, they proclaimed the independent Islamic State of Dagestan. In Tukchar, seized September 5th, militants poured gasoline on the walls of a barn where 6 Russian conscripts hid. Villagers had tried to shelter them. The smell of fuel filled the morning air as militants threatened to burn the soldiers alive unless they surrendered. The bombs followed. Buynaksk, September 4th, 9:45 at night. 64 dead. Moscow, Guryanov Street, September 9th, 5 in the morning, 94 killed. Survivors described being woken by a thud and then a collapsing sound as if an elevator shaft had fallen. Windows blew inward. A cloud of gray dust and the smell of gas filled the air. Some crawled barefoot over broken glass and concrete chips, hearing muffled screams from under the slabs. Moscow again, September 13th, just before midnight. 119 dead. Dust so thick, survivors wet towels and pressed them over their faces. Rescuers pulled bodies from air pockets where bathtubs had created cavities in the pancaked floors. Volgodonsk, September 16th, 17 dead. On September 24th, in Astana, Vladimir Putin gave his answer. "We will pursue the terrorists everywhere. If we catch them in the outhouse, we'll waste them in the outhouse. The question is closed." What followed was not improvisation, but calculation. On October 12, 1999, Russian forces crossed the Terek River. By October 15th, they held the heights north of Grozny, within artillery range. The advance moved slowly with one principle: fire first, advance later. Russian commanders ruled out a ground offensive into Grozny to avoid repeating the mistakes of 1994. Instead, they began a relentless bombing and shelling campaign in late November 1999. The bombardment was continuous. Bombs and artillery rained down without interruption. Streets emptied, except for figures slipping out for food at the market or water from nearby wells. On October 21st, a Scud missile struck the central marketplace. More than 140 people died, bodies torn apart among burning stalls. 6 days later, rockets hit the same market area again. Grozny journalist Movlady Ependiev went to document the scene. About an hour after the initial barrage, a new round of rockets fell 200 meters from the bazaar. Shrapnel killed him where he stood. The shelling of Grozny surpassed the shelling of Sarajevo by a factor of at least 50. Putin declared publicly that bombing would not stop until Russian troops fulfilled their task to the end. The doctrine had changed. Total destruction was preferable to urban combat. The bombardment became a rhythm of existence. Polina Zherobtsova, 14 years old, wrote in her diary on November 2, 1999, 2 weeks after shrapnel tore through her leg at the Central Market. In the spring, I will be 15 years old. If I am still alive, obviously. She recorded no blame. I don't scold anyone in particular, neither the rebels nor the Russian soldiers. There is no evil in the book, just the life of civilians who fell into life in war. French journalist Anne Nivat shared a 17-square-meter cellar with 20 Chechens, 5 of them small children, during the December bombardments. They slept on the floor, bodies pressed together in suffocating darkness. No water, no electricity, no ventilation except what filtered through cracks when the building above shook from impacts. The air tasted of concrete dust and unwashed bodies. When she emerged after one pause in the shelling, she found a nearby farmhouse struck by a rocket. 8 dead, 4 of them children. Others remained because they could not walk far. In one cellar, the water pipes burst from a nearby concussion. By the 5th day, the water had risen 3 centimeters, not enough to drown in, enough to make everything wet. Blankets, coats. The bread they had brought down turned to paste, and then to something that smelled of mold. By the 8th day, pneumonia set in. The man did not know what was happening to him. He knew only that his chest felt as though someone had filled it with broken glass, and that when the coughing started, it would not end until he had brought up something dark and thick that he could taste: copper and salt. On December 6, 1999, Russian forces dropped leaflets across Grozny: leave by December 11th or be destroyed. Persons who stay in the city will be considered terrorists and bandits. Everyone who does not leave will be destroyed by artillery and aviation. They announced a safe corridor running south through Alkan-Kala. Then they shelled it. Refugees who attempted the southern routes described a pattern that repeated with mechanical precision. Cars would gather at dawn, elderly passengers helped into back seats, children clutching bags. Then the whistling would begin. Shells landing on the road and in the fields nearby. Burning vehicles. Bodies covered with blankets in the snow. Those who survived abandoned their cars and continued on foot. One testimony described a scene near Alkan-Yurt. Several cars were burning. I saw at least 4 bodies on the roadside and a woman crying near a child who was dead. On the night of January 31st, the final breakout came. Chechen fighters and remaining civilians moved south toward Alkan-Kala in darkness. They walked into an unmarked minefield under continuous artillery fire. Witnesses described men screaming as mines detonated, bodies blown apart, the ground erupting in sequence as Russian mortars found the range. The survivors crawled over the bodies of those who had triggered the mines, using the dead as markers for the safe path. Those who survived reached the southern villages to discover that the bombardment had never been about military targets. A study ordered by Russian Human Rights Commissioner Sergei Kovalev estimated that 25,000 civilians had died in Grozny during the first battle alone. Of these, 22,000 were ethnic Russians. 85% of the dead were the very people Moscow claimed to be liberating. Elderly Russian pensioners who had lived through the siege of Leningrad died in their Grozny basements under shells fired by Russian guns. On February 2, 2000, Russian federal forces entered what remained of Grozny. What they captured was not a city, but a field of rubble. that the United Nations would later call the most destroyed city on Earth. Between 5,000 and 8,000 civilians died in the siege of the Second War. 80 to 85% of structures stood destroyed or damaged beyond habitability. Within 3 months of the city's capture, Putin's approval rating surged to 71%, built directly on televised images of Russian artillery blasting Grozny to rubble. The March 2000 presidential election confirmed that destruction itself had become politically profitable. The pattern established in those winter months became template rather than aberration. When Russian forces deployed to Syria in 2015, they sent Alexander Dvornikov, a veteran of both Chechen wars who would earn the title Butcher of Aleppo for applying Grozny's lessons. Mariupol in 2022 followed the same script. Bakhmut became another artillery-driven killing field. The through line connecting these cities is unambiguous: the primacy of artillery over infantry risk, the acceptance of total urban destruction as preferable to close combat, the willingness to render cities uninhabitable rather than fight for them, building by building. The siege of Aleppo replicated the Chechen model with precision: encirclement, systematic bombardment of residential districts, deliberate targeting of hospitals and infrastructure, the grinding reduction of opposition-held neighborhoods into uninhabitable rubble. By 2016, eastern Aleppo competed with Grozny for the designation of most destroyed urban landscape using an identical playbook. Grozny was not an exception born of desperation. It was the origin point of a doctrine that has governed Russian urban warfare for 2 decades, a template written in the winter of 1999 and applied without deviation ever since. One Chechen fighter crossed the minefield at 3 in the morning, following the man in front of him step by step. The man in front stepped on a mine. The explosion threw him backward into the snow. When his hearing returned, muffled as though his head were wrapped in cloth, he could see the man's legs lying 3 meters from the rest of him. He lay in the snow for a long time. The artillery continued to fall. Somewhere ahead, in the darkness beyond the minefield, there were supposed to be Chechen positions. Between him and that darkness was a field sown with explosives. He started crawling. The snow was cold against his belly. The bodies were colder. He did not look at their faces. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.